Texas Territory, 1867. A young woman with defiant amber eyes sits chained in the back of a prison wagon, her wedding dress torn and stained with blood that isn't her own. The 3 U.S. Marshals who took her believe they've captured an easy bounty worth $500 in government gold. What they don't know is that somewhere on the endless plains, the warrior the Comanche call Scarbringer, the man who has never lost a battle and never left an enemy alive, has discovered that his promised bride has vanished on what should have been their wedding day. The morning had started like something from a fairy tale. Evangeline Rose Sterling stood before the full-length mirror in her bedroom at Sterling Ranch, the finest spread in all of Brazos County, admiring the ivory silk wedding dress that had been shipped all the way from New York City. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 21, she was considered the most beautiful woman in 3 counties, with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of amber honey. More importantly to the ambitious men who courted her, she was the only daughter of Colonel Marcus Sterling, the wealthiest cattle baron between Austin and the Red River. Today was supposed to be the culmination of everything her father had planned for her since childhood. In 3 hours, she would marry Lieutenant James Crawford of the 5th Cavalry Regiment, a union that would join 2 of the most powerful families in Texas and cement her father's political ambitions. The wedding would be attended by senators, judges, and military commanders from across the state. What none of them knew was that Evangeline Rose Sterling had already given her heart to someone else entirely, a Comanche warrior whose very name struck terror into the hearts of settlers across the frontier. And in less than an hour, her carefully constructed world would come crashing down in ways that no one could have imagined. Evangeline's personal maid, Maria, bustled around the room making final adjustments to the dress, but she kept glancing nervously at her mistress's face. "Señorita Evangeline, you look pale. Are you feeling unwell?" "I'm fine, Maria," Evangeline replied, though her reflection told a different story. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she touched the pearl necklace at her throat, her mother's necklace, the one piece of jewelry that connected her to the woman who had died giving birth to her 21 years ago. The truth was that Evangeline hadn't slept in 3 days. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, bronze skin marked by ritual scars that proclaimed his victories in battle, dark eyes that could be gentle as a summer breeze or deadly as a prairie storm, and the proud bearing of a man who had never bowed to anyone. Kicking Wolf, war chief of the Comanche band that roamed the Llano Estacado, the man who had sworn to come for her when the time was right. The man she was betraying by marrying another in just 3 hours. The story of how the daughter of a cattle baron came to love a Comanche warrior began 18 months earlier, during the brutal summer of 1865. That year, the worst drought in living memory had turned the Texas plains into a wasteland of cracked earth and dying cattle. Colonel Sterling had pushed his men and his livestock to their limits, desperate to save the fortune he had built over 2 decades of shrewd dealing and military connections. It was during this crisis that Evangeline had first encountered the man who would change her life forever. She had been riding alone, against her father's explicit orders, to check on a distant waterhole when she discovered that it had been claimed by a small band of Comanche warriors. Any sensible person would have turned around immediately and ridden for help. The Comanche were at war with the white settlers, and encounters between the 2 peoples rarely ended without bloodshed. But what Evangeline saw when she crested the ridge overlooking the waterhole wasn't a war party preparing for a raid. It was a desperate group of people, men, women, and children, trying to save their dying horses and tend to their sick. The drought had affected everyone on the plains, regardless of race, and these Comanche were suffering just as much as the white settlers. Among them stood their leader, a man who carried himself with the unconscious authority of someone born to command. Even from a distance, Evangeline could see the ritual scars that marked his chest and arms, the eagle feathers in his long black hair that proclaimed his status as a war chief. This was Kicking Wolf, the warrior whose raids had made him a legend across the frontier, and the most wanted man in Texas territory. What happened next defied every convention of frontier warfare. Instead of attacking or fleeing, Evangeline had dismounted and approached the Comanche camp with her hands raised in the universal gesture of peace. She spoke no Comanche, and they spoke little English, but desperation has its own language. Using gestures and broken words, she managed to communicate that there was another water source 2 miles west, a hidden spring on sterling land that her father had never bothered to claim because it was so far from the main ranch. Kicking Wolf had studied her for a long moment with those penetrating dark eyes, clearly trying to understand why a white woman would help his people. Finally, he had nodded once and spoken a single word in English. Why? Evangeline's answer had come from somewhere deep in her soul, bypassing all the rational thoughts about propriety and safety. Because we're all trying to survive. That simple exchange had been the beginning of an impossible relationship that would span 18 months of secret meetings, shared dangers, and a love that grew against all odds and expectations. Over the following months, as the drought continued, and both white settlements and Comanche bands struggled to survive, Evangeline and Kicking Wolf had found excuses to meet at the hidden spring. What began as a practical arrangement, he would ensure that no raiding parties targeted Sterling Ranch, and she would warn him of military movements in the area, gradually became something far more personal and dangerous. Kicking Wolf taught Evangeline things no white woman was supposed to know. He showed her how to read the signs in nature that predicted weather and danger, how to move silently across open ground, how to understand the language of animals and birds. In return, she shared with him her knowledge of white man's tactics and politics, helping him understand the true scope of the forces arrayed against his people. But more importantly, they shared their dreams and fears. Kicking Wolf told her about his vision of finding a way to preserve Comanche culture while adapting to the reality of white expansion. Evangeline confessed her frustration with the limited life that society expected her to live, her desire to be more than just a pretty ornament in some man's house. "Your people and mine, we see only war between us," Kicking Wolf had said during one of their meetings the previous winter. "But you and I, we see another path." "What kind of path?" Evangeline had asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "A path where two worlds meet and create something new. A path where love is stronger than hate." The first time he kissed her, under a canopy of stars beside the hidden spring, Evangeline knew that her life had been irrevocably changed. This wasn't the polite courtship she had known with white suitors. This was passion that burned like prairie fire, consuming everything in its path. But their love existed in a world that would never accept it. To white society, Kicking Wolf was a savage murderer whose capture would bring a substantial reward. To his own people, Evangeline was the enemy, a member of the race that was systematically destroying their way of life. The only place their love could exist was in secret, in stolen moments beside hidden springs, and in dreams of a future that seemed impossible. Everything had changed 6 months ago, when Kicking Wolf made a proposal that took Evangeline's breath away. "I want you to become my wife," he had said simply, as they sat beside their spring watching the sun set over the endless Texas plains. Not in the white man's way, but in the Comanche way. as my equal, my partner in all things. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Evangeline's heart had soared, but her practical mind immediately grasped the impossibility of what he was suggesting. How could that ever work? Your people would never accept me and mine. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Her father would probably shoot Kicking Wolf himself if he discovered their relationship. There are ways, Kicking Wolf had insisted. My band is not like the others. We have survived by adapting, by learning from all peoples. Some of our women have taken white husbands when it served the tribe's interests. The reverse is also possible if the woman proves her worth. And how would I prove my worth? Kicking Wolf's expression had grown serious. There are trials, tests of courage and commitment. You would have to abandon your old life completely and embrace ours. You would have to prove that your loyalty lies with the Comanche people, not just with me. The weight of what he was asking had hit Evangeline like a physical blow. Give up everything, her family, her inheritance, her entire identity as a white woman, to join a people that most of her race considered little better than animals. It should have been an easy decision to refuse. Instead, she had said yes without hesitation. When, was all she asked. Soon. But first, I must complete the vision quest that will confirm my right to lead my people into the new world that is coming. The old chiefs think only of war and death, but I see a different future. One where Comanche wisdom survives, even if our old ways must change. They had planned it carefully over the following months. Kicking Wolf would complete his vision quest and return with the spiritual authority to make radical changes in how his band dealt with the white world. Meanwhile, Evangeline would find a way to delay her inevitable marriage to Lieutenant Crawford until Kicking Wolf could return for her. The plan had been working perfectly until 3 weeks ago, when her father announced that the wedding had been moved up by 6 months. Powerful political forces were pressuring Colonel Sterling to complete the alliance with the Crawford family immediately, and he had no intention of allowing his daughter's preferences to interfere with his ambitions. Evangeline had sent word to Kicking Wolf through their established network of messengers, but there had been no response. For all she knew, he was still somewhere on the sacred mountains, seeking the visions that would guide his people into an uncertain future. She was going to have to make the most important decision of her life, without knowing whether the man she loved would ever return. What Evangeline didn't know was that her secret had been discovered 3 days earlier by the 3 men who now represented the greatest threat to her future. Deputy U.S. Marshal Ezekiel Hawthorne, Marshal Samuel Corcoran, and Marshal Thomas Pike had been tracking Kicking Wolf for months, following a trail of evidence that had led them not to the Comanche warrior himself, but to the white woman who had been meeting with him. Hawthorne was the leader of their little group, a tall, thin man with cold blue eyes and the kind of smile that never reached above his lips. He had worn a badge for 15 years, but somewhere along the way he had discovered that there was more money to be made by bending the law than by enforcing it. The bounty on Kicking Wolf's head was substantial, $500 dead or alive. But Hawthorne had realized that there might be an even more profitable angle to pursue. Think about it, boys, he had explained to his partners as they camped outside Brazos Springs 3 nights earlier. We've got the daughter of the richest man in 3 counties secretly meeting with the most wanted Comanche in Texas. That's not just treason. That's a scandal that could destroy the Sterling family completely. Corcoran, a heavy-set man with a grey beard and a drinking problem, had caught on immediately. You're talking about blackmail. I'm talking about justice, Hawthorne had corrected with that cold smile. Colonel Sterling has been profiting from this war for years, selling supplies to the army at inflated prices while his own daughter consorts with the enemy. Seems to me that some of those profits ought to find their way into the pockets of the men who keep the peace out here. Pike, the youngest of the three, had looked uncomfortable with the plan. What if we just arrest her? Turn her over to the authorities and collect the reward for information leading to Kicking Wolf's capture? Hawthorne's expression had turned. Dangerous. Thomas, my boy, you're thinking too small. A reward is a one-time payment. What I'm talking about could set us up for life. Colonel Sterling would pay almost anything to keep his daughter's name out of the newspapers. But their plan had taken an unexpected turn when they approached Colonel Sterling that morning. Instead of agreeing to their blackmail demands, the old soldier had surprised them with a counteroffer that revealed just how deeply corruption had infected the law enforcement apparatus of Texas Territory. "Gentlemen," Sterling had said, his voice calm despite the devastating nature of what they were discussing, "I appreciate your discretion in this matter. However, I believe there's a solution that serves everyone's interests better than what you're proposing." "We're listening," Hawthorne had replied. "My daughter has clearly been compromised by her contact with this savage. She's no longer thinking clearly and can't be trusted to make rational decisions about her future. What she needs is time to recover from whatever influence has been exerted over her, time spent somewhere far from Texas, where she can remember who she really is." The three marshals had exchanged glances, beginning to understand where this was heading. "There's a private sanitarium in Denver," Sterling had continued, "that specializes in treating young women who have suffered various forms of mental disturbance. Dr. Whitman, the director, is an old Army friend of mine. He's helped other families deal with similar problems." "Problems like consorting with Indians?" Corcoran had asked. "Problems like temporary insanity brought on by traumatic stress," Sterling had corrected smoothly. "The kind of condition that requires extended treatment in a controlled environment, away from all familiar influences." Hawthorne had leaned forward, his instincts telling him that they were about to be offered something much more valuable than simple blackmail money. "And what would be in it for us?" $2,000 each, plus travel expenses to escort my daughter to Denver and ensure that she arrives safely at Dr. Whitman's facility. The paperwork has already been prepared. Commitment orders signed by 2 territorial judges, medical evaluations confirming her unstable mental state, everything completely legal and above board. The amount of money had been staggering. More than any of them would earn in 3 years of legitimate law enforcement work. But it was Pike who had asked the crucial question. "What about Kicking Wolf? If she's been meeting with him?" "Leave that to me," Sterling had replied grimly. "I have contacts in the military who have been looking for an excuse to launch a full-scale campaign against his band. Once my daughter is safely in Denver, I'll provide them with enough information about his movements to ensure that he's never a problem for anyone again." The wedding had been scheduled to begin at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with the ceremony taking place in the main parlor of Sterling Ranch and the reception following in the large barn that had been decorated with flowers and bunting for the occasion. By 1:30, guests had begun arriving. Politicians and military officers, wealthy ranchers and their wives, all dressed in their finest clothes for what was being billed as the social event of the year. Evangeline sat in her bedroom fully, dressed in her wedding gown, staring out the window at the dusty road that led away from the ranch. She was looking for any sign of a rider approaching, a Comanche warrior coming to claim his bride as he had promised. But the road remained empty, except for the carriages of wedding guests. "Señorita, it's time," Maria said softly from the doorway. "Your father is waiting downstairs." Evangeline closed her eyes and took a deep breath. If Kicking Wolf wasn't coming, then she would have to take matters into her own hands. She had already decided what she would do. She would go through with the ceremony, but she would find a way to escape afterward. Lieutenant Crawford seemed like a decent man, but she would not spend her life trapped in a marriage without love. especially when her heart belonged to someone else. "Tell my father I'll be down in just a moment," she said to Maria. As soon as the maid left, Evangeline moved quickly to her wardrobe and retrieved a small leather bag she had hidden there weeks earlier. Inside were the essential items she would need if she had to flee on her own. Men's clothing that would allow her to travel without attracting attention, what money she had been able to save, and most importantly, a detailed map showing the locations where she had met Kicking Wolf over the past 18 months. She had just finished hiding the bag under her wedding dress when she heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. Not her father's familiar tread, but the boots of multiple men moving with military precision. The door to her bedroom opened without a knock, and 3 men she had never seen before stepped inside. They wore the badges of U.S. Marshals, but something about their demeanor immediately put Evangeline on high alert. These weren't lawmen. They were predators. Miss Evangeline Sterling. The tall, thin man who appeared to be their leader spoke with a deceptively polite tone. "Yes, who are you, and what are you doing in my room?" "Deputy Marshal Ezekiel Hawthorne, Mum. These are my associates, Marshal Corcoran and Marshal Pike. We have a warrant for your arrest." Evangeline felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Arrest? For what? Hawthorne smiled that cold smile as he produced a folded document from his coat. Treason against the United States of America, specifically providing aid and comfort to hostile Indians engaged in acts of war against American citizens. The words hit Evangeline like physical blows. Someone had discovered her secret meetings with Kicking Wolf. But how? And why today, of all days? "That's ridiculous," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I've never provided aid to anyone." "Is that so?" Corcoran stepped forward, his breath reeking of whiskey even though it was barely past noon. "Then I suppose you can explain why you've been meeting regularly with the Comanche war chief known as Kicking Wolf? Or maybe you'd like to tell us about the information you've been passing to him about army movements and settler vulnerabilities." Evangeline's mind raced. If they knew about her meetings with Kicking Wolf, then they might also know about their plans. "I want to speak to my father. Your father is the one who provided us with the evidence of your treasonous activities," Hawthorne said smoothly. "He's quite concerned about your mental state, Miss Sterling. Apparently, this savage has exercised some kind of unnatural influence over you." The betrayal hit Evangeline like a sledgehammer. Her own father had sold her out to these corrupt lawmen. But why? What could he possibly gain by destroying his own daughter? As if reading her thoughts, Pike spoke up with obvious discomfort. "Miss Sterling, your father believes that you've been compromised by your contact with hostile forces. He's arranged for you to receive treatment at a private facility in Denver, where you can recover from whatever influence has been exerted over you." The pieces of the puzzle suddenly fell into place. This wasn't about law enforcement or justice. It was about her father's political ambitions. Her relationship with Kicking Wolf, if it became public, would destroy not only her reputation, but his as well. By having her declared mentally unstable and committed to an asylum, he could protect his own interests while eliminating the threat she represented to his carefully constructed image. "I'm not mentally unstable," Evangeline said firmly, "and I'm not going anywhere with you." Hawthorne's smile became genuinely unpleasant. "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make, Miss Sterling. We have legal authority to transport you to Denver for evaluation and treatment. Now you can come with us quietly, or we can make this unpleasant for everyone involved." Evangeline looked around her bedroom, seeing her entire life collapsing around her. Her father had betrayed her. These corrupt marshals were about to drag her away to some nightmare asylum, and Kicking Wolf was nowhere to be found. She was trapped, with no allies and no escape routes. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, a voice in the back of her mind reminded her of something Kicking Wolf had taught her during their time together. A true warrior never surrenders. Even when defeat seems certain, sometimes the only victory possible is to make your enemies pay a price for their triumph. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll come with you. But I want to say goodbye to my father first." Hawthorne considered this, then nodded. "5 minutes, and don't try anything foolish. We'll be watching every move you make." As they escorted her downstairs, Evangeline's mind was already working furiously. She might be trapped for now, but this game was far from over. And somewhere out on the vast Texas plains, the most feared warrior in the Comanche nation was about to discover that his promised bride had vanished. When Kicking Wolf learned what had happened, there would be a reckoning unlike anything the Texas frontier had ever seen. 300 miles northwest of Sterling Ranch, in the sacred mountains where the spirits of ancient warriors still walked among the living, Kicking Wolf emerged from his vision cave after 7 days of fasting and spiritual communion. The ritualistic scars on his chest and arms stood out starkly against his bronze skin, each one telling the story of a battle won, an enemy defeated, a test of courage passed. But the fresh cuts he had made during his vision quest told a different story, one of transformation and terrible purpose. The visions had been unlike anything he had experienced in his 32 years of life. Instead of the traditional images of buffalo hunts and warrior glory that usually came to Comanche men during their spiritual journeys, Kicking Wolf had seen something far more disturbing and prophetic. He had witnessed a world where two peoples, Comanche and white, were locked in an endless cycle of violence that would ultimately destroy both unless someone found the courage to forge a different path. In the final vision, he had seen himself standing at a crossroads with two paths stretching before him. One path led to the old ways, endless warfare, gradual defeat, and the slow extinction of his people. The other path was shrouded in mist and uncertainty, but it led towards something that had never existed before, a future where Comanche wisdom could survive even as the world changed around them. And at the end of that second path, he had seen her face, Evangeline Sterling, the golden-haired woman whose courage had first caught his attention and whose spirit had captured his heart. In the vision, she stood waiting for him with outstretched hands, but behind her loomed shadows that threatened to pull her into darkness. The message from the spirits had been clear. The time for preparation was over. His destiny and hers were intertwined, and if he delayed any longer, both would be lost forever. Kicking Wolf descended from the sacred mountain with the sunrise, his spiritual transformation complete, but his physical journey just beginning. He rode his war pony at a pace that would have killed a lesser horse, covering ground with the desperate urgency of a man racing against fate itself. The wedding was today. He had counted the days carefully during his vision quest, and if he didn't reach Sterling Ranch by afternoon, the woman he loved would be bound to another man by white man's law. What he couldn't know was that he was already too late, and that Evangeline's disappearance would transform his desperate ride to claim a bride into something far more dangerous. A hunt for vengeance that would make his legendary reputation seem tame by comparison. Kicking Wolf reached the hills overlooking Sterling Ranch just as the sun reached its zenith. From his vantage point among the scrub oak and mesquite, he could see the activity below. Carriages and horses gathered around the main house, people in fine clothes moving between buildings, all the signs of a major celebration in progress. The wedding was happening exactly as planned, but something was wrong. Even from a distance, Kicking Wolf's trained warrior senses detected an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with normal wedding excitement. The movements of the people below seemed agitated, confused. Small groups clustered together in intense conversation, and he could see riders departing at intervals, not guests leaving a celebration, but messengers being dispatched with urgent business. Kicking Wolf had lived his entire life reading the subtle signs that meant the difference. between life and death on the frontier. The scene below spoke of crisis, not celebration. Something had happened to disrupt the carefully planned ceremony, and his warrior instincts told him that whatever it was, it concerned the woman he had come to claim. He waited until the shadows began to lengthen before making his move. Using skills learned in 100 raids and battles, Kicking Wolf approached the ranch buildings under cover of darkness, moving like a ghost across terrain he had scouted during his previous meetings. With Evangeline, the hidden spring where they had shared so many conversations was only a mile away, and he knew every rock, every gully, every tree between here and there. The first person he encountered was Maria, Evangeline's personal maid, who was walking alone toward the servants' quarters, behind the main house. She looked distraught, her usually neat appearance disheveled, her eyes red from crying. When Kicking Wolf materialized out of the darkness before her, she should have screamed in terror. Instead, she recognized him immediately. "You," she whispered, in Spanish. "You are the one she spoke of." Kicking Wolf understood enough Spanish to follow her meaning, but he replied in carefully practiced English. "Where is she? Where is Evangeline?" Maria's face crumpled with fresh anguish. "Gone. They took her. The men with badges. They came during the wedding preparations and took her away." The words hit Kicking Wolf like physical blows. "What men? Who took her?" "Marshals. They said she was loca, sick in the mind. They had papers, orders from judges. Colonel Sterling, he signed papers too. They said she had to go to a hospital in Colorado." Kicking Wolf's blood turned to ice. He had heard stories of what happened to Indian women who were taken to white man's hospitals. Places where they experimented on people, tried to drive the spirit out of them, break them until they forgot who they truly were. The thought of Evangeline in such a place filled him with a rage so pure and terrible that for a moment he couldn't speak. "When?" he finally managed. "This morning, just before the wedding was to begin. She tried to resist, but they put chains on her, like a criminal." Maria's voice broke. "She called for you as they drove away. She said to tell you that she kept her promise, that she waited." The world around Kicking Wolf seemed to shift and blur. Evangeline had been taken, dragged away in chains while he was completing his vision quest in the mountains. The woman who had chosen love over safety, who had been willing to abandon everything for him, had been betrayed by her own father and delivered to men who would destroy her spirit as surely as if they had put a bullet through her heart. But she had called for him. Even in her darkest moment, she had believed he would come for her. Maria provided Kicking Wolf with every detail she could remember about the men who had taken Evangeline. 3 marshals, an older one with grey hair who smelled of whiskey, younger one who seemed uncomfortable with what they were doing, and a leader with cold eyes and a smile that never touched his face. They had a prison wagon, the kind used to transport dangerous criminals, and they were heading north toward the Colorado border. "How long ago?" Kicking Wolf asked. 12 hours, maybe more. They left before noon." 12 hours. Even pushing hard, a heavy prison wagon could only cover so much ground in that time, especially if they stopped for meals and rest. But Kicking Wolf wouldn't be slowed down by a wagon. He would be traveling light and fast, with a war pony bred for endurance and speed. He could make up the distance, but only if he started immediately. Before leaving, Kicking Wolf did something that would have been unthinkable for any other Comanche warrior. He approached the main house where Colonel Sterling was meeting with his remaining wedding guests, trying to explain the day's catastrophic events. The French doors to the parlor were open to catch the evening breeze, and Kicking Wolf could hear Sterling's voice as he fabricated his story. A complete breakdown. I'm afraid the strain of the wedding preparations, combined with some unfortunate influences she'd been exposed to. Dr. Whitman in Denver is the finest alienist west of the Mississippi. She'll receive the best possible care. Lieutenant Crawford, still, in his wedding clothes but looking shell-shocked by the day's events, asked the question that several others were clearly thinking. But why today? Why did this happen right before the ceremony? Sterling's pause was almost imperceptible, but Kicking Wolf caught it. Mental illness rarely follows convenient schedules, James. The important thing now is that Evangeline gets the help she needs. To recover, Kicking Wolf had heard enough. He melted back into the darkness and began preparing for what would be the most important hunt of his life. But first, he needed allies, and he knew exactly where to find them. 2 hours later, Kicking Wolf sat in council with his most trusted warriors around a carefully concealed fire in the hills above Sterling Ranch. These were men who had followed him through countless battles, who trusted his judgment even when they didn't understand his decisions. Tonight, he was asking them to trust him in something that defied every tradition of their people. "You want us to help you rescue a white woman," said Bearclaw, his lieutenant and closest friend since childhood. "A woman who is the daughter of our enemies. She is my woman," Kicking Wolf replied simply. "She chose us over her own people. She risked everything to warn us of army movements, to help us avoid their traps. Her loyalty to the Comanche has been proven in blood and sacrifice." "But she is still white," objected Running Elk, an older warrior whose distrust of all outsiders ran bone deep. "And now you ask us to make war on white lawmen for her sake. This will bring the entire army down on our heads." Kicking Wolf stood, his scarred chest gleaming in the firelight, every inch the war chief who had never lost a battle. "The army is already hunting us. The white leaders have already declared war on our way of life. They plan to destroy everything we are, everything we have been. I have seen this in visions, and I have seen it in the secret councils of our enemies." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "But I have also seen another path, a path where Comanche wisdom survives, where our children learn to live in the new world without forgetting who they are. That path begins with this woman, with proving that love can be stronger than hatred, that courage can overcome fear." Bearclaw studied his friend's face in the dancing firelight. "You believe she is truly one of us now?" "I believe she chose to become one of us when she could have chosen safety. I believe she earned the right to our protection when she risked her life for our people. And I believe that if we abandon her now, we prove that we are no better than the men who took her." The silence that followed stretched for long minutes as the warriors considered their leader's words. Finally, Bearclaw spoke. "How many men do you need? Enough to track them without being seen, enough to strike hard and fast when the time comes, but not so many that we leave our families defenseless if this goes wrong." 6, Bearclaw decided. "The best riders, the best fighters, men who can move like ghosts and strike like lightning." Running Elk shook his head, but reached for his weapons. "This is madness, but if we are going to commit madness, we might as well do it properly." By dawn, Kicking Wolf and his 6 chosen warriors were riding hard across the Texas plains, following the trail left by the prison wagon and its escort. The tracks were easy to read for men trained from childhood to track everything from wounded buffalo to enemy war parties. The deep ruts left by heavy wheels, the distinctive hoofprints of shod horses, even the places where the party had stopped to rest or relieve themselves. But as they rode, Kicking Wolf began to notice disturbing details that spoke of the true nature of Evangeline's captors. The wagon had made frequent stops, too frequent for simple rest breaks. At several locations, he found signs of struggle, scuffed earth, torn fabric, droplets of what looked suspiciously like blood. The men who had taken Evangeline were not treating her with the respect due to a prisoner being transported for medical treatment. They were treating her like cargo, or worse. The rage that had been simmering in Kicking Wolf's chest since learning of Evangeline's disappearance began to burn hotter. These were not lawmen doing their duty. These were predators who had seen an opportunity and seized it. The fact that they wore badges only made their crimes more despicable. By the second day, the trail led them into rougher country, where the prison wagon was forced to slow its pace considerably. Here, in the broken landscape of canyons and mesas that stretched toward the Colorado border, Kicking Wolf's war party began to close the distance. They rode in shifts, resting their horses in rotation while maintaining constant forward progress, using every trick of plains warfare to cover ground faster than should have been humanly possible. It was Bear Claw who first spotted the smoke. From their quarry's campfire, rising from a canyon perhaps 5 miles ahead, the war party had caught up to their prey just as the sun was beginning to set on the second day of pursuit. Kicking Wolf called a halt and gathered his warriors around him. "We scout first, learn their numbers, their weapons, their defenses, then we plan the attack." "Why not just charge?" asked Swift Arrow, the youngest of the group, his blood running hot with the prospect of battle. 7 against 3. The odds are in our favor, because she is in the middle of whatever fight we start, Kicking Wolf replied grimly. "One stray bullet, one moment of panic, and we lose everything we came to save. This requires precision, not just courage." As darkness fell across the canyon, Kicking Wolf and Bear Claw crept forward to observe their enemy's camp. What they saw there filled them both with cold fury that went beyond mere anger into something approaching holy wrath. The 3 Marshals had set up their camp in a natural depression that provided some shelter from the wind, but they had made no effort to post proper sentries or establish defensive positions. They were confident in their authority, secure in their belief that no one would dare challenge federal lawmen in the performance of their duties. Evangeline sat chained to one of the wagon wheels, still wearing the torn remnants of her wedding dress. Her golden hair was tangled and dirty. Her face showed the marks of rough handling, and her amber eyes blazed with undiminished defiance despite her circumstances. She had clearly not been broken by her ordeal. If anything, she looked more dangerous now than she had as a pampered rancher's daughter. The 3 Marshals sat around their fire, passing a bottle of whiskey and discussing their prisoner with the casual cruelty of men who had long since abandoned any pretense of honor or decency. "Think old Sterling will pay extra if we deliver her a little more compliant?" the heavy-set one with the grey beard was saying. "A few days in the Denver facility might not be enough to break a spirit like hers." The tall, thin leader, Hawthorne, Kicking Wolf remembered from Maria's description, smiled that cold smile. "Patience, Samuel. Dr. Whitman has his methods. By the time he's finished with her, she'll be grateful to marry anyone her father chooses." "And if she's not?" asked the youngest Marshal. "Then she disappears into the system permanently. There are worse fates than a comfortable asylum, especially for women who can't learn to know their place." Kicking Wolf's hand tightened on his warlance until his knuckles went white. These men weren't just corrupt, they were evil in the purest sense, men who took pleasure in destroying others for their own profit and amusement. They deserved no mercy, no chance to surrender, no opportunity to explain or justify their actions. But first, he needed to get Evangeline to safety. Whatever justice was coming for her captors would have to wait until she was out of danger. As he and Bear Claw crept back to where the other warriors waited, Kicking Wolf was already formulating the plan that would free his promised bride and begin the reckoning that these corrupt lawmen had brought upon themselves. The time for patience was over. The time for half measures had passed. Tomorrow, the men who had dared to steal the woman chosen by the most feared warrior on the Texas frontier would learn why the Comanche called him Scarbringer and why his enemies rarely lived long enough to regret crossing him. But tonight, he would wait and plan and prepare, because when Kicking Wolf finally struck, it would be with the precision of a master warrior and the fury of a man whose heart had been torn from his chest. The corrupt Marshals had made their choice. When they decided to profit from Evangeline's suffering, Now they would discover that some choices carry consequences more terrible than death itself. Dawn came grey and cold to the canyon, where Evangeline Sterling sat chained to a wagon wheel, her wedding dress now a tattered mockery of the dreams she'd harbored just 3 days ago. But the woman who watched the corrupt marshals stumble around their morning campfire was no longer the sheltered rancher's daughter who had been dragged from her father's house. 3 days of brutal treatment and constant threats had burned away the last of her illusions about civilized society, leaving behind something harder and infinitely more dangerous. Marshal Hawthorne kicked dirt over the dying embers of their fire, his cold eyes surveying their prisoner with the calculating gaze of a man appraising livestock. "Time to move, Princess. We've got ground to cover before the heat gets too bad." Evangeline didn't respond immediately. Instead, she continued the mental exercise that had kept her sane during the nightmare journey, cataloguing every detail about her captors that might prove useful if she got the chance to escape or fight back. Hawthorne favored his right leg, probably an old injury that would slow him down in a chase. Corcoran was drunk more often than sober, his reflexes dulled by constant whiskey consumption. Pike, the youngest, carried himself like a man uncomfortable with his role in this crime, which meant he might hesitate at a crucial moment. More importantly, she had been listening to their conversations around the campfire, learning things that filled her with both hope and terror. They weren't taking her directly to Denver as they'd claimed. Instead, they planned to hold her at an abandoned trading post for several days, while Hawthorne traveled ahead to make arrangements with the asylum director. The delay would give them time to ensure their story was airtight and their payment secure, but it would also give someone else time to find her, if that someone was looking. "I said move," Hawthorne repeated, his voice carrying an edge of menace. Evangeline looked up at him with eyes that had learned to hide their fire behind a mask of apparent submission. "The chains are cutting into my wrists. I need them loosened, or I won't be able to ride much longer." Corcoran laughed harshly from where he was loading their supplies back into the wagon. "Maybe if you'd been more cooperative from the start, we wouldn't need the chains." "Cooperative how?" Evangeline asked, injecting just enough innocence into her voice to make the question seem genuine rather than challenging. The three marshals exchanged glances, and Evangeline saw something pass between them that made her stomach clench with fresh fear. These men had been restraining themselves so far, maintaining at least the pretense that they were lawmen transporting a prisoner. But that pretense was wearing thin, and she could see the predatory hunger growing stronger in their eyes each day. Pike cleared his throat uncomfortably. "We should stick to the plan, get her to the trading post, make the exchange, and be done with this." "The plan can be flexible," Hawthorne said slowly, his gaze never leaving Evangeline's face. "Especially if our prisoner decides to be more accommodating." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, and Evangeline felt something cold and deadly settle in her chest. These men had already shown they were willing to destroy her life for money. Now they were hinting at violations that would make death seem like mercy, but instead of the terror they expected to see, Evangeline's expression remained perfectly calm. "I understand," she said quietly. What the marshals didn't understand was that Evangeline Sterling had spent 18 months learning from a Comanche war chief how to survive in a world where death was always one mistake away. She had learned to read the signs of approaching danger, to assess threats and opportunities with a warrior's cold calculation. Most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the only way to win was to make your enemies underestimate you until the moment you struck. The game was about to change, and these corrupt lawmen had no idea what they were really dealing with. 5 miles away, Kicking Wolf lay flat on his belly atop a rocky outcropping, studying the terrain ahead through eyes that had been trained from childhood to see what others missed. The abandoned trading post where the Marshals planned to hold Evangeline sat in a natural bowl, surrounded by low hills, a defensible position that would have been ideal for its original purpose of sheltering travelers and traders from hostile forces. Now it would serve as a trap, but not in the way the corrupt lawmen intended. Bear Claw crawled up beside his war chief, moving with the fluid silence that marked him as one of the finest scouts in the Comanche nation. "The woman was right," he whispered, referring to Maria's detailed description of the Marshals' route and intended destination. "They arrived 2 hours ago and have been scouting the buildings ever since," Kicking Wolf nodded grimly. His network of informants, built over years of careful cultivation among Mexican traders, disgruntled cavalry deserters, and others who lived on the margins of frontier society, had provided crucial intelligence about the abandoned outpost. The main building was stone and timber, built to withstand both weather and attack. There were 3 smaller outbuildings, a corral for horses, and a well that still provided fresh water. Most importantly, there were multiple ways in and out if you knew where to look. "The guards?" Kicking Wolf asked. "One posted on the main building's roof, another watching the horses. The third is inside with the prisoner. They're confident, lazy. They think their badges make them untouchable. Their confidence will be their death," Kicking Wolf said with quiet certainty. "What about the woman? Have you seen her?" Bear Claw's expression darkened. "They dragged her inside an hour ago. She was fighting them, even with the chains. This one has the heart of a warrior." Pride and fury warred in Kicking Wolf's chest. Evangeline was proving her courage even in captivity, but every moment she remained in those men's hands increased the danger she faced. The predatory way they had been looking at her in their canyon camp had not escaped his notice during the previous night's reconnaissance. "The others are in position?" he asked. "Swift Arrow and Running Elk are covering the escape routes to the north and east. Broken Lance and Hunting Bear have the southern approach. Grey Wolf waits with the horses at the rally point." Kicking Wolf studied the trading post layout one more time, memorizing every detail, every angle of approach, every potential obstacle or advantage. What he was planning went against every tradition of Comanche warfare. His people fought from horseback in the open, using speed and mobility to overwhelm their enemies. They didn't creep through buildings like assassins in the night, but traditions were made to be broken when the stakes demanded it, and nothing had ever mattered more to Kicking Wolf than the woman being held prisoner in the stone building below. "Remember," he told Bear Claw as they prepared to descend from their observation point, "she must not be harmed. Whatever happens to us, whatever price we pay, she walks away from this alive and whole." Bear Claw clasped his war chief's shoulder. "She will. I give you my word as a warrior and a brother." Inside the main building of the trading post, Evangeline sat on a wooden crate in what had once been the proprietor's living quarters. Her chains now secured to an iron ring that had been set into the stone wall. The room smelled of dust and abandonment, but it was cleaner and more secure than their previous camping spots. The Marshals had clearly used this place before for purposes they didn't want to discuss. Hawthorne stood by the single window, periodically checking the approaches to the trading post through a gap in the boarded-up opening. His partners were outside, ostensibly standing guard, but actually passing a bottle back and forth while complaining about the heat and their growing impatience with the entire situation. "You're wondering why we stopped here," Hawthorne said without turning around. "Why we didn't go straight to Denver like we told your father." Evangeline kept her expression neutral. "I assumed you had your reasons." "Smart girl. Yes, we have our reasons." He turned to face her, that cold smile playing around his lips. "The truth is, your father's payment was just the beginning. Dr. Whitman in Denver, he's willing to pay extra for certain types of patients. Young, attractive women from wealthy families make excellent subjects for his research." The casual way he discussed selling her like livestock should have terrified Evangeline. Instead, it simply confirmed what she had already suspected about these men and strengthened her resolve to see them pay for their crimes. However, Hawthorne continued, moving closer to where she sat chained, there might be another option, a way for both of us to profit from this situation. I'm listening. Your father is wealthy, but he's not the only wealthy man in Texas. There are others who might pay handsomely for information about his business dealings, his political connections, his vulnerabilities. Hawthorne crouched down so his face was level with hers. Work with me, provide me with that information, and I can make sure you end up in a much more comfortable situation than Dr. Whitman's asylum. Evangeline pretended to consider the offer while her mind raced through the implications. Hawthorne wasn't just corrupt. He was building a network of blackmail and extortion that reached into the highest levels of Texas society. Her disappearance was just one piece of a much larger criminal enterprise. What kind of information, she asked. Names of his political contacts, details about government contracts, information about other wealthy families who might have secrets they'd pay to. Or keep hidden. Hawthorne's smile widened. A smart, well-connected young woman like yourself must have heard all sorts of interesting conversations over the years. And if I cooperate, you'll let me go. I'll make sure you're well taken care of. New identity, comfortable living situation, somewhere far from Texas. You'd have to give up your old life completely, but you'd be alive and free. It was a tempting offer, especially compared to the alternative of ending up as a test subject in some nightmarish asylum. But Evangeline had learned something important during her 18 months with Kicking Wolf. Sometimes the most dangerous trap was the one that looked like salvation. I need time to think about it, she said. Hawthorne stood up, satisfied that he had planted the seed of collaboration. Of course, but don't take too long. My patience has limits and my partners are getting restless. Corcoran especially has been making suggestions about how we might motivate you to be more cooperative. As he moved back toward the window, Evangeline allowed herself a small, secret smile. These men thought they were so clever, so sophisticated in their corruption. They had no idea that they were being hunted by a force of nature that made their petty cruelties seem like children's games. Somewhere out in the Texas wilderness, the most feared warrior of the Comanche nation was coming for his promised bride. And when he arrived, these corrupt marshals would learn the difference between the law they claimed to represent and the justice they were about to receive. The attack began at sunset, when the light was perfect for confusion, and the shadows were deep enough to hide a small army of ghosts. Kicking Wolf had timed it precisely, using every advantage that terrain and tactics could provide. The first sign of trouble was when the marshal on the roof simply vanished. One moment Pike was pacing back and forth across the flat stones, rifle in hand, scanning the empty landscape for threats that he was certain would never come. The next moment he was gone, as completely as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Corcoran noticed first, squinting up at the roofline through whiskey-blurred vision. "Hey, where'd Pike go?" Before anyone could answer, an arrow sprouted from the wooden beam inches from Corcoran's head. The marshal stumbled backward, his bottle shattering on the ground as he clawed for his sidearm. "Indians, we're under attack!" But the expected war cries and thundering hoofbeats never came. Instead, there was only silence, the kind of deadly quiet that settles over the prairie before a tornado strikes. The silence of predators moving through tall grass, of death approaching on silent feet. Inside the main building, Hawthorne heard Corcoran shout and moved swiftly to his prisoner. "Looks like your savage boyfriend finally showed up," he snarled, drawing his revolver and pressing it against Evangeline's temple. "Too bad he's too late to save you." But Evangeline was no longer the helpless captive he thought he was threatening. The sound of Corcoran's alarm had sent a surge of fierce joy through her heart. Kicking Wolf had come for her, just as he had promised. Now she just had to survive long enough for him to reach her. "He's not too late," she said with quiet confidence. "You are." What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was an execution carried out with the precision of a surgeon's blade and the inexorable certainty of a natural disaster. The Comanche warriors moved through the trading post complex like spirits of vengeance, striking without warning and vanishing back into shadows that seemed deeper than they should have been. Corcoran managed to get off 3 wild shots before. Bearclaw's war lance took him in the chest, punching through his badge and the corrupt heart beneath it. He died without understanding what had killed him, his whiskey-fogged brain unable to process the reality of his situation until it was far too late. The marshal watching the horses lasted longer, managing to wound Swift Arrow with a lucky pistol. Shot before Running Elk's tomahawk ended his resistance, but his death cry echoed across the compound, alerting everyone within miles that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Inside the main building, Hawthorne listened to the sounds of his men dying and felt the first stirrings of genuine fear. These weren't random Indian raiders. This was a coordinated assault by warriors who knew exactly what they were doing. The kind of precise, deadly operation that only came from careful planning and extensive reconnaissance. "Your friends are all dead," he told Evangeline, trying to keep his voice steady. "But you're coming with me. Maybe if I have a hostage, your boyfriend will be willing to negotiate." Evangeline looked at him with pity rather than fear. "You still don't understand, do you? There's no negotiation with a man like Kicking Wolf. There's only justice." As if summoned by his name, the door to the room exploded inward. Kicking Wolf stood in the doorway like an avatar of primal fury, his war paint gleaming in the lamplight, his scarred chest rising and falling with controlled breathing. He held a tomahawk in one hand and a knife in the other, both weapons stained with the blood of Hawthorne's partners. The corrupt marshal pressed his gun harder against Evangeline's head, his hand shaking with terror and desperation. "Stay back! I'll kill her, I swear I will." Kicking Wolf's dark eyes fixed on Hawthorne with the kind of concentrated attention that a hawk gives to a rabbit. When he spoke, his voice was soft and deadly calm. "You have taken what belongs to me. You have hurt what I protect. There is no forgiveness for this." I said, "Stay back." But Kicking Wolf was already moving, flowing across the room with the liquid grace of a hunting cat. Hawthorne's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Evangeline threw herself sideways with all the strength her chains would allow. The bullet meant for her head buried itself in the stone wall, and then Kicking Wolf was on, the corrupt marshal, like a force of nature. What happened next was both too fast and too slow, a moment of violence so pure and concentrated that it seemed to exist outside normal time. Hawthorne's scream cut off abruptly, and then there was only silence. When the killing was finished and the chains had been cut from Evangeline's wrists, she found herself in Kicking Wolf's arms for the first time in 3 months. The feel of his strong hands on her face, the warmth of his body against hers, the scent of sage and leather, and something indefinably masculine that was uniquely his. It all combined to make her feel truly safe for the first time since the marshals had dragged her from her father's house. "I thought you weren't coming," she whispered against his chest. "I thought the vision quest had taken too long, that you'd arrived to find me already married to Crawford." "I will always come for you," Kicking Wolf replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Distance cannot stop me. Time cannot delay me. Death itself could not keep me from your side." They held each other in the blood-stained room, while Bearclaw and the other warriors secured the trading post and gathered intelligence from the marshal's belongings. What they found painted a disturbing picture of corruption that reached far beyond 3 criminals looking for easy money. The thin one kept detailed records, Bearclaw reported, holding up a leather-bound ledger. Names, amounts, descriptions of crimes. This network reaches into the highest levels of territorial government. Kicking Wolf studied the ledger, his expression growing darker as he read. They were planning to sell her to this Dr. Whitman for his experiments, and after that... He couldn't finish the sentence. Evangeline took the book from his hands and flipped through its pages, her anger growing with each revelation. My father didn't just betray me to save his reputation. He was part of this whole system, the marriage. To Crawford, the commitment papers, all of it. He was selling his own daughter to protect his criminal associates. The magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. Colonel Sterling hadn't just sacrificed his daughter's happiness for political advantage. He had knowingly delivered her to men who planned to destroy her mind and soul for profit. "What do we do now?" Evangeline asked. "This ledger contains enough evidence to bring down dozens of powerful men, but who can we trust to act on it?" Kicking Wolf was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that all carried terrible risks. Finally, he looked at her with the expression of a man who had made a decision that would change everything. "We disappear," he said simply. "Tonight, we ride north to the high country where my people are waiting. You become my wife in the Comanche way, and Evangeline Sterling dies in this place along with the men who tried to destroy her. And the evidence? The ledger? We send it to someone who can use it, someone with the power and the motivation to see justice done." He smiled grimly. "Your Lieutenant Crawford, perhaps. A man betrayed on his wedding day might be very interested in learning why his bride disappeared." Evangeline nodded slowly, understanding the elegance of the plan. Crawford had political connections and military authority. More importantly, he had been personally humiliated by the day's events and would want answers. If the evidence was presented improperly, he could become a powerful ally in bringing down the corruption that had destroyed so many lives. As the warriors prepared to leave the trading post, Evangeline took one last look around the room where she had nearly died. 3 days ago, she had been the pampered daughter of a wealthy rancher, living a life of comfortable lies and careful compromises. Now she was something else entirely. A woman who had chosen love over safety, truth over comfort, and justice over the easy path of forgiveness. The transformation was complete, and there would be no going back. When they rode out into the Texas night, Evangeline Sterling rode with them as the promised bride of the most feared warrior on the frontier. Behind her lay everything she had, a bean. Ahead lay everything she was meant to become. The corrupt Marshals were dead, but their crimes had revealed a web of corruption that reached to the highest levels of territorial society. That web would be torn apart, thread by thread, until justice was satisfied. Some promises were kept with flowers and wedding vows. Others were kept with blood and fire, and the absolute certainty that love could conquer any enemy, no matter how powerful or well-protected they might seem. Kicking Wolf had kept his promise. Now it was time to see what kind of future they could build together in a world that would never again underestimate the power of a warrior's love or a brave woman's determination to be free. Fort Richardson, Texas. 3 days after the trading post-massacre, Colonel James Morrison stood in his office studying the carnage documented in the photographs spread across his mahogany desk. 3 federal marshals butchered with primitive weapons, their bodies arranged in what his scouts claimed were ritual patterns of Comanche justice. The trading post itself had been burned to the ground after the killings, leaving only charred timbers and the lingering smell of smoke to mark where Hawthorne's corruption network had finally met its match. Morrison was a career soldier who had spent 15 years fighting Indians across the frontier, but even he felt a chill looking at these images. This wasn't random violence or opportunistic raiding. This was calculated retribution carried out with surgical precision. Whoever had planned this operation possessed intimate knowledge of military tactics and an understanding of psychological warfare that rivaled anything Morrison had seen during the Civil War. Lieutenant James Crawford entered without knocking, his usually immaculate uniform wrinkled and his face haggard from 3 days of hard riding. In his hands he carried a leather satchel that seemed to weigh more than its size suggested. "You found something," Morrison said. "It wasn't a question." Crawford nodded grimly. "More than I bargained for, sir. This goes deeper than anyone imagined." He opened the satchel and withdrew Hawthorne's ledger, along with a bundle of correspondence that had survived the fire. Marshal Hawthorne wasn't just corrupt. He was running a criminal enterprise that reaches into the territorial government itself. Morrison accepted the ledger with hands that remained steady despite the implications of what Crawford was telling him. As he read, his expression grew darker with each page. Names he recognized, amounts that staggered him, crimes that made his stomach turn. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking. "Governor Phillips is mentioned 17 times, Crawford said quietly. "Judge Cartwright, Senator Mackenzie, even some of our own officers at Fort Concho. They were all paying Hawthorne for various services, falsified reports, disappeared evidence, prisoners who never made it to trial." "And Miss Sterling?" Crawford's jaw tightened. "She wasn't just an innocent victim, sir. According to these records, her father was one of Hawthorne's biggest clients. The marriage arrangement, the commitment papers, even the timing of her disappearance. It was all orchestrated to eliminate her as a threat to their operation." Morrison closed the ledger and leaned back in his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 53 years. What kind of threat could a rancher's daughter possibly pose to men with this much power? The kind that comes from 18 months of secret meetings with the most wanted Indian in Texas territory. Crawford opened a second folder and withdrew. A series of documents that painted a picture Morrison found almost impossible to believe. Surveillance reports, witness statements, even sketches made by Army scouts, all confirming that Evangeline Sterling had been conducting regular meetings with the Comanche war chief known as Kicking Wolf. She was feeding him intelligence, Crawford continued, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Troop movements, supply routes, patrol schedules. Half the successful raids over the past year can be traced back to information she provided. Morrison studied one of the sketches, a detailed rendering of a young woman with golden hair meeting with a scarred Indian warrior beside a hidden spring. The artist had captured something in their body language that spoke of intimacy beyond. Mere conspiracy. You think she was working with him willingly? I think she was in love with him, sir. And I think that love made her choose sides in a way that none of us saw coming. The admission cost Crawford something to make. 3 days ago, he had been preparing to marry the woman he believed was the perfect military wife. Beautiful, well-connected, and safely conventional. Now he was confronting the reality that his bride-to-be had been living a double life that made her not just a traitor, but a traitor motivated by passion for his enemy. Morrison set down the sketch and fixed his subordinate with a sharp look. "What do you want from me, Lieutenant?" "Permission to hunt them down, sir, both of them. She's committed treason, and he's responsible for the deaths of dozens of soldiers and civilians. They need to face justice." "Justice?" Morrison's laugh was bitter. "According to this ledger, we wouldn't recognize justice if it walked through that door and introduced itself. Half the men we report to are criminals, and the other half are too corrupt or cowardly to do anything about it." Crawford straightened, his military bearing asserting itself, despite the personal pain he was carrying. "Then we make our own justice, sir. We do what's right, regardless of who it inconveniences." Morrison studied the young officer for a long moment. Crawford had been betrayed and humiliated, but instead of retreating into self-pity, he was channeling his anger into something that might actually accomplish some good. It was exactly the kind of response Morrison would have expected from one of his better officers. "What do you propose?" Crawford had clearly thought this through during his 3 days of investigation. He moved to the wall map and began pointing out locations with the precision of a man who had spent considerable time studying his quarry. Kicking Wolf's band moves in a predictable pattern through the high country northwest of here. They have seasonal camps, water sources they return to regularly, hunting grounds they defend against other tribes. If we move fast and light, we can intercept them before they disappear into the deep wilderness. Morrison studied the map, his experienced eye catching details that a younger officer might miss. "Those are rough mountains, Lieutenant. Comanche country. They'll see us coming from miles away. Not if we use their own tactics against them. Small strike force, moving at night, using Indian guides who know the territory as well as they do." Crawford's finger traced a route through the mountain passes. "I've already made contact with a group of Tonkawa scouts who have personal grudges against Kicking Wolf's band. They'll track him for the chance at revenge. And when you find them," Crawford's expression hardened, "we bring them back to face trial, both of them. Let a jury decide what justice looks like." Morrison wasn't entirely convinced that Crawford's motives were as pure as he claimed. There was something in the young man's eyes that spoke of personal vendetta as much as legal duty. But perhaps that was exactly what this situation required. Someone with enough personal investment to see it through to the end. "How many men do you need?" 20. "All volunteers, all unmarried. This won't be a standard patrol. We'll be operating beyond the reach of reinforcements or resupply. If something goes wrong, we'll be on our own." Morrison nodded slowly. "Consider it approved. But Crawford, I want them alive if possible. Dead martyrs are harder to discredit than living prisoners, and we need these corruption charges to stick." As Crawford gathered his papers and prepared to leave, Morrison called after him, "One more thing, Lieutenant. Are you certain you can do this? Hunt down the woman you were supposed to marry?" Crawford paused in the doorway, his back still turned. "She made her choice, sir. Now she has to live with the consequences." 200 miles northwest, in a hidden valley where ancient spirits still walked among the living pines, Evangeline Sterling was learning what it meant to become Comanche. The transformation wasn't just physical, though the traditional dress and intricate beadwork marked her new identity clearly enough. It was deeper than that, a fundamental shift in how she saw herself and her place in the world. The women of Kicking Wolf's band had initially greeted her with suspicion that bordered on hostility. A white woman taking their war chief as husband was unprecedented, and many questioned whether someone raised in the soft world of ranches and parlors could ever truly understand the harsh realities of their nomadic life. But Evangeline had surprised them. Instead of expecting special treatment or complaining about the primitive conditions, she had thrown herself into learning their ways with an intensity that impressed even the most skeptical. She could now tan hides, weave baskets, identify edible plants, and track game across terrain that would have baffled her civilized friends. More importantly, she had proven her loyalty in the most decisive way possible by choosing their world over her own, even when that choice meant abandoning everything she had previously valued. Kicking Wolf found her that evening, sitting beside the sacred fire that burned at the center of their camp, working on a pair of moccasins that would mark her final acceptance into the tribe. Her golden hair was now braided with eagle feathers and colored beads, and the soft white skin of her rancher's daughter days had been bronzed by sun and wind into something that belonged to this harsh landscape. "You are troubled," he observed, settling beside her with the fluid grace that marked all his movements. Evangeline continued stitching for a moment before answering. "I'm thinking about what we left behind, the ledger, the evidence of all that corruption. Do you think Crawford will act on it?" "Does it matter?" The question surprised her. "Of course it matters. Those men destroyed dozens of lives for profit. They need to face justice. Kicking Wolf was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dancing flames. Justice is not always what white men call law. Sometimes justice is a corrupt marshal, dying with a tomahawk in his chest. Sometimes justice is a traitor's daughter choosing exile over comfort. His words carried a weight that made Evangeline look at him more closely. There was something in his expression, a knowledge that he hadn't shared with her yet. "What aren't you telling me?" Instead of answering directly, Kicking Wolf reached into his medicine bag and withdrew a small piece of paper that had been folded many times. When he handed it to her, Evangeline recognized the careful script of one of their network of informants. The message was brief but devastating. "Soldiers coming. 20 men. Tonkawa guides. They seek the golden-haired woman and her warrior husband. 3 days behind, moving fast. The betrayed groom leads them." Evangeline felt the world shift beneath her as the implications sank in. Crawford wasn't just investigating her disappearance, he was actively hunting her. The man she had been supposed to marry had become her most dangerous enemy. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since yesterday. I wanted to give you one more night of peace before we discussed what comes next." Evangeline looked around the camp, at the women who had finally begun to accept her, at the children who had started calling her by her Comanche name, at the life she had built from the ashes of her old existence. All of it was about to be swept away by forces she had set in motion months ago. "We run," she said simply. Kicking Wolf shook his head. "Running will only delay the inevitable. Crawford has Tonkawa guides. They know this country as well as we do, and winter is coming. We cannot keep moving indefinitely with women and children slowing us down." "Then what do you propose?" When Kicking Wolf smiled, it was the expression of a predator who had just decided to stop being prey. "We make them wish they had never started hunting us." The plan Kicking Wolf outlined was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of fleeing deeper into the wilderness, they would use the approaching soldiers' expectations against them. Crawford and his men would be looking for a retreating war party, trying to stay ahead of pursuit. They wouldn't expect to walk into a carefully prepared ambush in terrain that favored defenders over attackers. "The narrow pass where Weeping Creek cuts through the red rocks," Kicking Wolf explained, sketching the terrain in the dirt beside their fire. "Only one way in, only one way out. If we position our warriors correctly, 20 soldiers become 20 targets." Evangeline studied the rough map, her strategic mind, honed by months of planning intelligence operations, immediately grasping the tactical advantages. "What about the Tonkawa guides? They'll smell a trap." "The Tonkawa have been our enemies for generations. They know our ways, but they also know our pride. They will expect us to face them honorably, warrior to warrior, in open battle. They will not expect us to fight like white men, from concealment, using deception and patience instead of courage and fury." It was a radical departure from traditional Comanche warfare, and Evangeline could see the reluctance in some of the warriors' faces as Kicking Wolf explained the plan. For a people who measured honor by personal courage in battle, hiding in rocks and shooting from ambush felt dangerously close to cowardice. But desperate times demanded desperate measures, and the survival of the entire band depended on stopping Crawford's expedition before it could report back to Fort Richardson. "There's something else," Evangeline said quietly. "Something we need to consider." Kicking Wolf waited for her to continue. "Crawford isn't just hunting us for military reasons. This is personal for him. I humiliated him in front of the most powerful people in Texas. He won't stop until he's restored his reputation, and bringing back the traitor bride who chose an Indian over him would do exactly that." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. This wasn't going to end with a single ambush or a tactical victory. Crawford would keep coming, keep hunting, keep escalating until one of them was dead. Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance, Kicking Wolf said with quiet finality. Tomorrow, we end this hunt before it can go any further. As the camp prepared for what might be their final battle, Evangeline Sterling, who was now something else, sat beside the sacred fire and contemplated the strange path that had brought her to this moment. 3 months ago, she had been a sheltered rancher's daughter whose biggest worry was choosing the right dress for her wedding. Now she was planning an ambush that would determine whether she lived as a free woman or died as a fugitive. The transformation was complete, and there would be no going back. Tomorrow would bring either victory or death, but it would not bring surrender. Some bridges once burned could never be rebuilt. Evangeline had made her choice, and now she would live or die by its consequences. The hunter was about to become the hunted, but the prey had developed teeth of its own. Dawn came blood-red over the Texas mountains, painting the canyon walls in shades of rust and copper that seemed to prophesy the violence about to unfold. Lieutenant Crawford crouched behind a boulder at the mouth of Weeping Creek Pass, studying the narrow defile through his field glasses with the methodical attention of a professional soldier who had learned that carelessness was often fatal. Something was wrong. His Tonkawa scouts had been growing increasingly agitated over the past hour, muttering among themselves in their native tongue and casting nervous glances at the towering rock walls that hemmed them in on both sides. These were men who had tracked Comanche war parties across half of Texas, warriors whose hatred for Kicking Wolf's people ran deeper than blood feuds. They should have been eager for the confrontation ahead. Instead, they looked like men walking into a trap. "What do your scouts say?" Crawford asked Sergeant Martinez, his most experienced non-commissioned officer. Martinez spat tobacco juice into the dust and shook his head grimly. "They don't like the smell of this place, sir. Too quiet. No birds, no small game, nothing moving. Except the wind. They say it feels like death." Crawford lowered his field glasses and considered their options. They had been tracking Kicking Wolf's band for 3 days through increasingly difficult terrain, following a trail that had grown steadily fresher with each mile. According to the Tonkawa, they were no more than a few hours behind their quarry, close enough to force a confrontation before the Comanche could disappear into the deep wilderness, where even the best trackers would lose them. But the pass ahead represented a tactical nightmare. Narrow walls, limited visibility, multiple positions for ambush, and only one way in or out. Every instinct Crawford had developed during his years of frontier warfare screamed at him to find another route, to avoid the obvious trap that the terrain represented. Yet time was running out. Winter storms were building in the high country, and if they didn't catch Kicking Wolf's band within the next day or two, the weather would force them to abandon the pursuit until spring. By then, Evangeline Sterling and her Indian husband would be ghosts, vanished into the vast emptiness of the frontier as completely as if they had never existed. "We go through," Crawford decided, "but we go carefully. Martinez, spread the men out in single file, 20 yards between each soldier. If this is an ambush, I don't want us bunched up like sheep for slaughter." As his men prepared to enter the pass, Crawford found himself thinking about the woman they were hunting. 3 days of hard riding had given him plenty of time to process the revelations contained in Hawthorne's ledger, and the picture that emerged was nothing like the innocent victim he had expected to rescue. Evangeline Sterling had made her choice with clear eyes and full knowledge of the consequences. She had chosen passion over duty, love over loyalty, and the primitive freedom of Indian life over the civilized comforts of her father's world. The Faye woman he had planned to marry had never really existed. She had been an illusion, a carefully constructed facade hiding someone far more dangerous and unpredictable than he had ever imagined. The realization should have made his duty easier. Instead, it only deepened the personal wound that drove him forward with relentless determination. Kicking Wolf watched the soldiers enter his trap with the patient satisfaction of a spider observing flies walking into its web. From his concealed position high among the red rocks, he could see the entire length of the pass stretched out below, like a natural killing ground. His warriors were positioned at carefully chosen points along both walls of the canyon, invisible to the men below, but able to deliver devastating crossfire when the signal came. Beside him, Evangeline lay flat against the sun-warmed stone, her golden hair now darkened with charcoal, and her face painted with the traditional war markings of a Comanche warrior woman. The transformation was complete. The rancher's daughter, who had once worried about choosing the right dress for a social gathering, now held a Winchester rifle with the steady hands of someone prepared to kill to defend her new life. "The one in front," she whispered, pointing to Crawford's distinctive figure leading the column. "That's him. That's the man I was supposed to marry." Kicking Wolf studied his enemy with professional interest. Crawford moved well for a white soldier, keeping proper spacing and maintaining alertness despite the strain of 3 days' hard pursuit. This was not the soft garrison officer that Kicking Wolf had expected, but a genuine fighting man who understood the realities of frontier warfare. "He will not be easy to kill," Kicking Wolf observed. "Good," Evangeline replied with cold satisfaction. "Easy deaths teach no lessons." The viciousness in her voice might have shocked the people who had known her in her previous life, but it didn't surprise Kicking Wolf. He had seen the same transformation in other people, white captives who had chosen to become Comanche, settlers, who had crossed the line between civilization and savagery. Once someone embraced the harsh realities of life on the frontier, they often became more ruthless than those born to it. The last soldier entered the pass. Kicking Wolf raised his hand, holding his warriors in position for a few more precious seconds. Timing was everything in an ambush. Strike too early, and the enemy might escape the trap. Strike too late, and they might fight their way out through discipline and superior firepower. When Crawford's column reached the exact center of the pass, Kicking Wolf dropped his hand. The first volley of rifle fire echoed through the canyon like the voice of an angry god, magnified and distorted by the rock walls until it became a sustained roar that seemed to shake the mountains themselves. Crawford's carefully spaced column disintegrated as soldiers dove for whatever cover they could find, but the pass offered few hiding places that weren't already covered by Comanche rifles. 3 men went down in the first seconds, not dead, but wounded badly enough to be out of the fight. Crawford himself rolled behind a fallen boulder and began shouting orders, trying to impose military discipline on what was rapidly becoming a massacre. "Return fire. Pick your targets. Martinez, get those men moving toward the north wall." But his Tonkawa scouts had already broken, abandoning their white allies to save themselves, as arrows and bullets rained down from positions that seemed to be everywhere at once. Their expertise in tracking Comanche war parties hadn't prepared them for facing Comanche tactics when the roles were reversed. Evangeline sighted carefully on a soldier who was trying to work his way toward better cover and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked against her shoulder, and the man spun around before collapsing against the canyon wall. She felt no satisfaction from the kill, no surge of bloodlust or triumph, only the cold certainty that this was necessary for her survival, and that of the people she had chosen as her own. Crawford spotted the muzzle flash from her position and sent 3 quick shots in her direction, chips of stone exploding inches from her head. The man could shoot. She had to give him that. Under different circumstances, he might have made a decent husband for a conventional rancher's daughter who wanted nothing more than safety and respectability. But she was no longer that woman, and these were not those circumstances. The battle raged for 20 minutes that felt like hours, with the advantage shifting back and forth as Crawford's surviving soldiers found defensive positions and began to fight back with the stubborn courage of professional cavalry. But the Comanche held the high ground and knew every inch of the terrain, while the soldiers were trapped in an increasingly untenable position. When Crawford realized that his tactical situation was hopeless, he made the kind of desperate decision that separated living officers from dead heroes. Instead of trying to fight his way out of the trap, he began moving toward the position where he had seen Evangeline's muzzle flash, using covering fire from his remaining men to work his way up the canyon wall. Kicking Wolf saw the danger immediately. "He comes for you," he called to Evangeline across the battlefield. "Fall back to the second position." But Evangeline had seen Crawford's movement too, and instead of retreating, she shifted to intercept him. The personal nature of this confrontation demanded a personal resolution. She had made her choice to abandon the life he represented. Now, it was time to face the consequences of that choice directly. They met on a narrow ledge halfway up the canyon wall, two people whose lives had been intertwined by fate and severed by irreconcilable differences. Crawford's uniform was torn and blood-stained, his face grim with the knowledge that most of his men were already dead or dying. But his eyes still burned with the determination that had driven him across 200 miles of hostile territory. "It didn't have to be this way," he said, his revolver trained on her chest. "You could have been my wife. We could have had a good life together." Evangeline looked at him with something that might have been pity. "A good life? Married to a man I didn't love, living a lie, pretending to be someone I was never meant to be. That's not life, James. That's just a pretty form of death. And this is better, living like a savage married to a killer, raising half-breed children who will never belong in either world?" "This is honest," she replied simply. "This is real. This is choosing to live according to my own heart instead of other people's expectations." Crawford's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Kicking Wolf's war lance took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol clattering across the rocky ledge. The Comanche war chief appeared like a materializing spirit, moving with the fluid grace that had made him legendary among his enemies. Crawford reached for his fallen weapon, but Kicking Wolf was already there, the razor-sharp edge of his tomahawk pressing against the soldier's throat. "You have tracked us far enough," Kicking Wolf said in careful English. "Your men are dead. Your mission has failed. It is time for you to join them." But Evangeline stepped forward, her hand resting gently on her husband's arm. "No, let him live." Both men stared at her in surprise. After everything Crawford had done, all the death and destruction his pursuit had caused, mercy was the last thing anyone expected from her. "Let him live," she repeated, "but send him back with a message. Tell everyone what you found here. Tell them that Evangeline Sterling chose her own path and will kill anyone who tries to drag her back to the old one. Tell them that some choices can't be undone and some people can't be saved from themselves." Crawford looked into her eyes and saw a stranger, someone harder and more dangerous than the woman he had planned to marry, but also more alive, more authentic, more true to herself than she had ever been in her father's world. When he rode out of the canyon an hour later, the sole survivor of his expedition, Lieutenant James Crawford carried with him the knowledge that some wars can't be won because the enemy refuses to be what you need them to be. Behind him, in the Valley of Death, that had claimed 19 good soldiers, Evangeline Sterling finished her transformation into someone entirely new. The last link to her old life had been severed, and the woman who emerged from that blood-soaked canyon would never again be mistaken for a victim or a prize to be won. She was something else now, something the frontier had never seen before, and might never see again. 6 months after the Canyon Massacre, Austin buzzed with rumors that threatened to topple the territorial government. Lieutenant Crawford's testimony, backed by Hawthorne's recovered ledger, had triggered investigations that reached into the highest levels of power. Governor Phillips resigned in disgrace. Judge Cartwright fled to Mexico ahead of federal marshals, and Senator Mackenzie was found dead in his study with a pistol in his hand and a confession letter on his desk. But the most dramatic moment came when Colonel Marcus Sterling was arrested at his own ranch, dragged from his morning coffee by federal agents who cared nothing for his wealth or political connections. The man who had sold his own daughter to protect his criminal associates now faced charges that would see him spend the rest of his life in prison if he lived long enough to stand trial. In his cell at the Austin jail, Sterling received an unexpected visitor. Crawford entered without ceremony, his uniform bearing the insignia of his recent promotion to captain. The month since the canyon battle had aged him, carving lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and burdens no young officer should carry. "Come to gloat?" Sterling asked, his voice hoarse with defeat. Crawford shook his head. "Come. Do ask a question. Why? Why did you do it? Betray your own daughter, destroy your own family. For what? Money you already had? Power you already possessed?" Sterling laughed bitterly. "You think this was about greed? Boy, you understand nothing. This was about survival. The old Texas is dying, and men like me either adapt or get swept away. I chose to adapt by becoming a criminal, by becoming realistic. The frontier is closing, the Indians are being driven onto reservations, and the cattle business is becoming corporate. Men with vision saw the change coming and positioned themselves accordingly." Crawford studied the broken man before him, once one of the most powerful figures in Texas, now reduced to justifying his crimes to a junior officer. And Evangeline? What was she to you? Just another business asset to be liquidated when convenient. For the first time, Sterling's composure cracked. "She was my daughter, I loved her, but she chose them over us, chose savagery over civilization. What was I supposed to do? Let her destroy everything I'd built?" "You were supposed to trust her judgment. You were supposed to believe that your daughter might know her own heart better than you did." Sterling's laugh turned into a cough that shook his entire frame. "Trust? She was meeting with the enemy, passing military secrets, planning to abandon everything decent for a life of barbarism. You call that knowing her own heart?" Crawford was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. "I do. Because she chose something real over something safe. She chose love over convenience, and maybe in a world full of men like you and me, that's the most civilized thing anyone can do." In the high country, where the Colorado Rockies met the endless sky, Evangeline watched her husband teach their 6-month-old son the ancient songs of his people. The child, named Thomas Kicking Wolf in honor of both his bloodlines, gurgled contentedly as his father's deep voice carried across the mountain meadow where their band had made its winter camp. The woman who held the baby bore little resemblance to the rancher's daughter who had once worried about choosing the right dress for social occasions. Her golden hair was now braided with eagle feathers and beads that told the story of her acceptance into the tribe. Her hands, once soft from a life of privilege, were calloused from the work of preparing hides, gathering food, and crafting the tools necessary for survival in the wilderness. Most dramatically, her amber eyes held a depth and intensity that spoke of someone who had looked death in the face and chosen life on her own terms. "He will grow up in a different world than either of us knew," Kicking Wolf observed, settling beside his wife on the buffalo robe that served as their family. Gathering place, Evangeline nodded, her gaze following the smoke rising from their lodge toward the snow-capped peaks that surrounded their sanctuary. A world where being half white and half Comanche might be an advantage instead of a curse. A world where the old boundaries don't matter as much as what's in a person's heart. They had heard the news of her father's arrest through their network of informants, former soldiers, Mexican traders, and others who moved between the civilized world and the frontier. Justice had finally caught up with the corruption that had destroyed so many lives, though it had come too late for the victims and at too high a price in blood and betrayal. "Do you ever regret it?" Kicking Wolf asked. "Everything you gave up to be here?" Evangeline considered the question seriously, as she considered all important things these days. "I regret the pain it caused. I regret that my father couldn't understand my choice. I regret that good men died because of decisions I made. But regret choosing you, regret choosing this life? Never." She looked down at their son, who had inherited his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. "This little one will grow up knowing that love is stronger than fear, that courage matters more than comfort, and that sometimes the most important choice you can make is to be true to yourself, even when the whole world tells you you're wrong." Years passed, and the story of the rancher's daughter who chose a Comanche warrior over civilized society became legend throughout the Southwest. Some versions painted Evangeline as a victim of savage corruption, others as a traitor who betrayed her own race. But the version that endured, told around campfires and in frontier saloons, was different. In that version, she was something new, a bridge between worlds. A woman who proved that love could transcend the boundaries that men drew between peoples. The story grew in the telling, acquiring details and embellishments that transformed historical figures into mythic archetypes. But in a hidden valley high in the Colorado Rockies, the reality was simpler and more profound than any legend. A family lived there. Husband, wife, and children who embodied the possibility of a different future. They were neither white nor Indian, neither civilized nor savage, but something entirely new. Americans in the truest sense, shaped by the vast land itself, rather than by the fears and prejudices of those who claimed to own it. When travelers occasionally stumbled upon their camp, they found not the bloodthirsty savages or corrupted captives that frontier mythology suggested, but people who had chosen to build their lives according to their own vision of what happiness might look like. The woman still had golden hair and amber eyes, but she moved with the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. The man still bore the scars of a warrior, but his face held the contentment of someone who had won the only battle that truly mattered. Their children, growing numerous as the years passed, were something the frontier had never seen before. Genuinely bicultural, equally comfortable with Comanche traditions and the practical skills needed to survive in a changing world. They spoke 3 languages, understood 2 cultures completely, and belonged entirely to neither and both. The woman who had once been Evangeline Sterling lived to see the end of the Indian Wars, the closing of the frontier, and the transformation of Texas from a wild territory into a modern state. She watched from her mountain sanctuary as the world changed around her, sometimes visiting the edges of civilization to trade or gather news, but always returning to the life she had chosen. She never saw her father again. Marcus Sterling died in prison, broken by the consequences of his own choices. She never spoke to James Crawford after their confrontation in the canyon, though she heard that he had become a respected officer who championed better treatment for Indian tribes. The corruption network that had nearly destroyed her was dismantled completely, its members dead, imprisoned, or exiled. But the most important victory was quieter and more personal. In a world that insisted people must choose between civilized and savage, white and Indian, safety and freedom, she had proven that other choices were possible. She had shown that love could be stronger than fear, that courage could overcome convention, and that sometimes the most radical act was simply being true to yourself. When she died, many years later, surrounded by children and grandchildren, who carried her story into a new century, the woman who had once been kidnapped by corrupt marshals left behind something more valuable than any rancher's fortune or political dynasty. She left behind proof that in America, anyone could choose to become something entirely new. Some bridges are built of stone and steel, Others are built of human hearts willing to span the distance between worlds that seem impossibly far apart. The strongest bridges of all are those built by people brave enough to stand in the middle, belonging completely to neither side, but connecting both in ways that change everything for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.